Hello and welcome to the MilVet Podcast. Your podcast hosts are Brendan Aronson and Tim Shaw. We are military veterans, entrepreneurs, and investors. Most importantly, we strive to empower military service members, veterans, and their families. We believe that every veteran deserves a career that fires them up, a career in which you can learn, earn, and build a world-class network. On this podcast, we interview civilian and military veteran leaders who are incredible founders, writers, thinkers, and investors. Our primary goal is to inspire you to achieve great things. Let's dive into today's episode.
Today's guest is Nate Kouhana, a former Green Beret and the founder and CEO of Anthem Snacks. Anthem Snacks is partnered with the biggest combat sports company, the UFC. We're going to dive into Nate's journey from being a Green Beret who earned 2 Bronze Star medals and a Purple Heart. After leaving the military, he worked at a company in San Francisco and now resides in Montana. Anthem Snacks is not just another snacks company. It's a symbol of premium, veteran-owned nourishment, delivering an explosion of flavors and proteins to ignite your day. I can say this, I'm a repeat customer and have bought their incredible products at PX's, and hopefully you'll get some too. Nate's not just a seasoned warrior and an innovative entrepreneur, but a scholar. He holds an MS from the University of Texas at Austin and an MBA from Booth. I really look forward to learning about Nate's journey through the military and entrepreneurship today. Nate, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Looking forward to this.
Nate, to kick us off, can you share your journey? And please actually talk like hometown and go through the details, whether it's high school, Army, but we'd love to learn your journey.
Oh man, I'm be turning 45 this year, so it's pretty long. I grew up in Houston, Texas. Went to Bel Air High School. Out of high school, ended up going to college in upstate New York. I was actually studying abroad when 9/11 happened. I was in Paris at the time, and it was just kind of crazy, and it was surreal to kind of see. I like to tell people it was like seeing what was happening, but through people outside of, people other than Americans. And at the time, it was just like everyone, right? It was crazy, and so just seeing that made me just think like, hey, what can I do? How can I get involved? Like everybody during the GWAT era. I rushed to, recruiter's office to see what was possible. That was September. By October, I really thought everything was kind of over at that point. We had ODAs on the ground in Afghanistan, and it seemed like we kind of squashed the Taliban. So I actually went about, finishing college at that point, and then Iraq kicked off. And then at that point, I knew this was going to be a long, drawn out we were going to be in a couple theaters, multiple theaters at the same time. And so for me, I finished college, went down to the recruiting office. I was going to I wanted to be a Marine officer. And at the time there was about a 6-month wait list, which I thought was kind of crazy. I asked the guy, I was like, I want to join right now. And he was like, everybody wants to join right now. He's like, you're not the only one. There's a line out the door. And so at that point, I went to the Army recruiting office and the Navy recruiting office. They were kind of in the same strip mall in Houston. And it really came down to the recruiter. We had some mechanic pitching me on, guys jumping out of planes and doing all this other stuff. And so I signed up to be a 18 X-ray, which was pretty much a Green Beret, an opportunity to be a Green Beret at that point. And so I joined in 2003, and that kind of kicked off my journey into the military. So I'll kind of pause there. If you got any follow-on questions, I don't know where you want me to pick up from there, but I'm happy to go through kind of the whole pipeline and everything like that.
Please talk about the 18 X-ray program and your journey in the Army.
Yeah, it was, at the time I wasn't sure if it was real, to be honest with you. It just seemed kind of crazy that you can try out right off the street, but it kind of made sense. You figure we were in multiple theaters at war. They needed guys. The catch was you sign up for 6-year contract, and if you don't make it, you're at the needs of the Army, which means you could be in Korea or wherever you were going to be. And so, looking at it for me, it was just like I thought I had the rest of my life to sit behind a desk somewhere, and so I had an opportunity to fight for my country and really kind of test myself and see what I was made of, right? Everyone has assumptions of what, how they would act given adversity in certain situations, but I was going to really put it to the test. And so when I signed up, we started out, went to what was it, Fort Benning in Georgia. I don't know if that's still the name or not, but we went there and then went through basic training. And you kind of went in there with a cohort of about, I think 100 people had the same X-ray program, had the same contract. And so you went from basic training to airborne school to SOPSI, which is Special Operations Preparation Course. And by the time you made it to selection and you actually graduated selection, I think there was only like 10 or 11 of us at the time. So the attrition rate was pretty wild. But the guys that you ended up kind of gravitating towards all had the same values, so you didn't really notice it as much. And it was challenging, but when you don't have any other options, when you're sitting there looking at the possibility of being in Korea or being somewhere else, it was like you had to make it. And I loved it, to be honest with you. Like I thought physically, mentally, everything it was testing me at all the different levels. And so once you made it through selection, that really just began the process of going through what they call the qualification course. And depending on what language you take and depending on what MOS you are, that could be anywhere from 9 months to, I think at the time, it could be a year and a half, 2 years, right? It just depends. And so I went through that process, went through all the different training, all the different schools. And then I got to a team, and my team, you show up and it's a bunch of grown men who were, war fighting heroes at the time. That's what they were, right? And I joined at 23, and these guys are 40 years old with multiple deployments, decorated. And I had just missed Iraq by a couple of weeks, the cutoff. So I was kind of sitting around waiting for my team to show up, and they showed up, and I was put on the Halo team, so the military free fall team, which was super cool. A bunch of senior guys, all E7s at the time. Like I said, decorated. And that kind of kicked off my journey. I was extremely humbled. Whatever you learned in the Q course, whatever you thought you were, as soon as you show up to a team, you realize you weren't much. And you were just, I was trying to be a sponge and soak everything up. And luckily I had a mentor on the team who was our chief warrant officer, Scott Dyer, who ended up dying later on. But he kind of took me under his wing, kind of showed me the ropes, got me involved, made sure I got into the schools I needed to go to. And I worked under him for a little while as kind of the ASOT level 2. So I was doing some of that stuff with him. And that was just kind of my journey on starting team life. So I'll just kind of pause there. That was me getting to the team and then really working on my skill set.
A few things you said there that I want to build on. First is there were a number of folks who didn't make it through the 18 X-ray program that went to conventional units. And I know this as a conventional guy. And many of those soldiers were oftentimes some of the most capable and competent folks, like incredibly capable and competent. The other thing that you said that's fascinating is how long that training is, from 9 months to as much as, say, like 15 months. And that makes sense given the typical pipeline through SF is you're in a conventional unit, then you apply, then you go through that, right? So like you're getting a real crash course. But the thing that a lot of our guests have identified and we've echoed a lot of is that the military does a really good job with training. We find that the military is really good at training, and especially compared to the civilian world. I'm curious how you feel about that.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. They do a really good job of kind of breaking you down and then making sure everybody is built from the ground up. That way we're all uniform. We've all been trained the same way. We all have standard operating procedures. That starts from everything from, making your bed in the morning, cleaning your boots. And by the time you make your way to weapon systems and you do more complex things, you have that same structure in mind. And it's really meant to, at least at a team level, on an A team, everyone is cross-trained, right? So even though there is a medic and a demolition guy and a weapons guy, at the end of the day, everyone is trained kind of from the ground up to do the basics. And then that becomes your foundation. And then from there, you get and build your skill set, which is how you scale ultimately, right? And it's not that much different than playing other sports where it's blocking and tackling. It's just a matter of can you move this big ship, right? And that's about scalability. And they do an amazing job of that.
And Halo teams are really hard to get in. My understanding of SF teams is most folks first go to like a quote unquote normal SF team, and then they will graduate maybe to like a scuba team or a halo team. Is that right or not?
It's probably different around. In my case, they were trying to make sure, and I can't confirm this, but at the time they were looking at kind of your background. They were looking at, your PT tests, your aptitude, all that stuff, where they thought you could add value to the team. And that's where I got matched up. Most of the time, you're correct, right? You end up switching teams often anyway. And then most of those guys that start off on mountain, teams or something like that, or conventional teams, end up making their way to the scuba or the halo teams.
And can you talk about your time within Special Forces?
Yeah, it was amazing. Like I said, it was a lot of humility to start. And then over time, you kind of build your confidence, you get reps underneath you. And that's really going through exercises, going through training with the team, going through schools and doing all that. And then ultimately it culminates in going downrange. I mean, that's why you do all this, right? And so my first trip downrange, I just it was like a fire hose, got put, feet to the fire, and it's a little bit of sink or swim. You have to have high conviction in what you've been trained in, but most of all, you have to have the ability to really just adapt, right? Because a lot of the stuff happens in real time, and at the end of the day, you want to make sure you're there, you're accountable for the guy next to you. That's ultimately what it comes down to. Doesn't matter how well you did on a PT test or how well you performed in some specific school. When you're under fire and it's really time to perform, can you perform? And so for me, that was the most important piece. And so going downrange with guys that have been downrange, soaking up all of their knowledge, getting out there, doing your first combat missions, getting into your first firefights, that was super important. And so first deployment was in 2006. We actually got tasked with a special mission that was doing kind of cross-border stuff. It was heavy on the level 2, level 3 stuff, which is advanced special operations. So that was kind of the first trip, which was eye-opening in its own right. I learned so much. Coming back from that trip, it was like night and day. I felt so much more confident in just kind of where my place was within the unit, within the team. So by the time we went back down in 2007, I was feeling much better about what I can contribute at the team level and taking on leadership positions. And so the 2007-2008 trip, I was then the head ASOT person on the team. So in charge of running all the sources, collecting the intels for the human piece of this, putting that together, which working with your 18 Fox, which is your intel analyst, that was how you got outside the wire. You got target packages to actually go execute on missions. And so if I didn't do my job, a lot of times we didn't get the resources allocated to us to go execute the missions we needed to do. And that was important. And on that trip, that 2007-2008 trip, I actually got, in one of our firefights, I actually got wounded. I took a grazing headshot. So it went through my ear pro, through the Kevlar, down the back of my head. I was out unconscious for a little while, came back into it in the middle of a firefight. One of the guys that was attached to our team, unfortunately, we lost him. He got shot in the face. I got medevaced out with him. And so coming back from all that took weeks just to get your equilibrium. They wanted to send me home, which I didn't want to do. The most important thing to me was I wanted to get back, make sure I got kind of right back on that horse, and that I could overcome the piece, which was I was in a firefight and I was shot and I was hit. I didn't want to change. I didn't want that to change my attitude and what I can contribute to the team. So 3 weeks later, we went right back into the same valley where we got in that huge firefight. And that was important to me, like I said, just to kind of get over that hump. And then we did missions from there on out, which was great. And then, but coming out of that, by the time I got home, I realized a lot had changed for me. Going on the halo jumps, normally do 12, 5, 13,000. And I could feel just kind of the piercing in my head. I could tell that I had no hearing in my left ear. My equilibrium was still a little bit off. And the pressure that was hitting me as we went above 13. So if you do a hey-ho and you're really doing oxygen at 17.5, up to 21,000, I just couldn't even take it. I mean, it was just unbearable. And then going through the shoot house, I couldn't really tell what direction fire was coming from. And so at some point you look over and you're just like, I don't even know if I'm an asset to the team at this point. And is this really what I want to be doing? I was already 29 years old. And so for me, it was like, you're either going to stay in, kind of hit the 10-year mark, and make your way to 20, or it's time to transition and kind of look for the next thing. And for me, I chose to do that right as the financial crisis happened, which was, I looked at it as an opportunity, but it was a little nerve wracking not knowing the state of our economy at the time. But I ended up leaving in 2009.
And when you left in '09, did you know what you wanted to do next, or was it react to contact?
Yeah, honestly, I had no idea. It felt like I did 6 years at that point. It felt like I was 6 years behind everybody else, is honestly how it felt. And so most of the guys that were getting out at that time, you ended up taking a private sector job, really doing what you did in the military, just getting paid better, to be honest, like contracting. And so I looked at doing that for DoD. I looked at joining one of the agencies. And so for me, I just wasn't sure what was next. I had a friend who was going to Stanford. So I was doing let me back up. I was doing some government contracting like everybody else. And then I just realized if I'm really going to move on, I need to move on. I can't kind of stay in the same contracting world doing this. And I felt like I was already behind, like I said, 6 years in getting the skill set in the civilian world. And so I had a buddy that was going to Stanford at the time, to business school, but he had been working in Deloitte, doing consulting already. So I felt like, he could apply what he had been doing into business school. It just didn't make sense for me at the time. I didn't really understand what I'd get out of it or how that would translate over. But I visited him in Palo Alto, and I kind of fell in love with San Francisco at the time. As crazy as that sounds, but tech seemed like a complete 180 from what I was doing. It just seemed like they were moving quickly, breaking a lot of stuff, which was so different than coming from the military. Even though I was in a flat, small organization, it's still a risk mitigation to do anything over there. And the idea of just learning something new and kind of throwing myself into it at the time seemed really appealing. And the culture was different. It was just all new to me. Like I said, I grew up in Texas, so I never really lived in California. So I packed my bags and I moved to San Francisco with no real plan, to be honest with you. I just decided I'm going to make it here. So I moved, I got an apartment. And from there, I ended up meeting one of the founders that was working at a startup. And he was like the first intern at Facebook. And so it seemed like it was super interesting what he was doing. And he asked me to join the team. I was like the first non-developer that was on the team. And that started off, a completely new journey for myself.
For veterans, one of the most difficult things is that transition, because all of us feel like we're 4, 5, 6, 10 years behind our cohorts because we spent that time serving our country. I know I felt that way. And I felt like getting that first internship and first job was so difficult. Did you feel that way? And do you feel that way still?
At the time, for sure, I felt that way. I mean, being in San Francisco, you just had a lot of smart people, right? Everybody there seemed to have gone to some Ivy League school or some really good university, and they kind of carved out what they were doing. At least the people I was meeting early on the creative side, whether it was design or whether it was in tech and development and stuff like that. And I didn't even know where to start, to be honest. For me, when I joined this team, I told him I would intern for free, and luckily, you just couldn't do that in California. He's like, I got to pay you something. So I was just going to get there and just soak it all up and just kind of leave behind the life I had lived. I think there was some misconceptions of what he thought I was and what the team thought I maybe brought to the table. They probably pictured, a military guy with like a hoorah kind of building a team and highly motivated, and didn't really understand that I came from a small team that, you really kind of relied on yourself to get stuff done. You were resourceful, but they weren't huge teams that we were working with. And so I tried to overlay what I had learned, honestly, doing level 3 advanced operations, special operations, into figuring out how to do business development and working with project management. And I just sat there and I just, became really good friends with all the developers just to really learn their world and what it meant, how they thought, just everything. It was all new to me. It was all so interesting. There was a lot of smart people there. And so for me, that's what I did. And again, just being super humble about it, starting from the bottom with no ego, understanding that you don't know where the path is, where this goes, but at least you give it a shot. And I figure if you fail, that's okay. It'll be interesting. You'll learn a lot along the way, and you can move on. And you can always go back to doing, what I did in the military on the private sector.
A few things I want to build on what you said. First is my belief is that a lot of veterans who go into startups do so because they love a high op tempo. They like risk because risk is oftentimes commensurate with reward. And I'm curious, do you think that's the case or not?
In my case, for sure it is. The idea of sitting in a cubicle working for some Fortune 500 company was just not what I was going to do. And there's, for anyone that does that, no disrespect, that just wasn't, I already felt like I was playing catch up, and to sit there and just kind of work my way through the corporate ladder just was not appealing to me. I wanted to take the same process I went through being on a team, which is a small team, wearing wearing different hats at different times, really having the most impact and getting the most out of the experience with the risk and the thrill of what you were doing, knowing everything you poured into this thing, there were real consequences, right? In our case, somebody could die, but even in a startup, everyone's relying on you. You've got to carry your weight. And so for me, it was very appealing to work for a startup where you wore many different hats. And again, when you're playing catch up, if I was working in a corporate setting, depending on what my job function was, that's all I would be doing. And yes, you'd become specialized in doing that, but there's no way I could have hung out with all the developers and understood how they think, what project management looks like, how they make decisions. That was extremely valuable to me. And then the risk piece of it, which is, like the asymmetric piece of this, which is, it's risky, but the reward could potentially be really big, right? And for me to just take the fire hose and get like a lifetime experience in, 4 to 5 years was worth it.
Your journey was working at a startup, doing your own startup. That's actually my journey too. And I find that it's really helpful because you get to see someone else build, you get to see someone else make mistakes, you get to kind of learn on someone else's dime. I'm curious, how helpful was being at a startup before you did your own startup for you?
Very helpful. And I will say they're completely different industries. The risk appetite for, being in tech versus being in CPG is completely different. I walked out of that experience. I was able to, be in board meetings. I was able to sit on the venture side. We worked with top tier investors like Founders Fund and Formation 8, Salesforce Ventures, so I got to see how they looked at this, how they underwrite, risk, right? And what they were looking for, at the time. But I also got to see what the founder went through. And the founder had enormous pressure. Once they took a lot of, when they did a big capital raise, there was enormous pressure that came with that to kind of, win your category, if you will, right? And my particular founder was, like I mentioned, he was the first intern at Facebook. So, there was pressure for him to be the next Mark Zuckerberg, right? And just to see that, and no matter how disciplined you are, no matter what your values are, you just tend to change your vision, and you tend to change according to whatever the pressure is. And I saw what that meant in the hiring process. I saw what that meant in the stress level process. Now, granted, he was 26 at the time, so I don't even know if he fully knew himself going through that, but I still got to see what that looked like, right? And it's a very capable, intelligent guy with the weight of the world on him, showing up to board meetings nervous, showing up to, with expectations and everything else. And so for me, when I started my company, it was important to kind of remove that from the equation. I was going to take it at my own pace. Nothing was going to compromise what my vision was for the company or what my values are. Even if that meant I left plenty of money on the table, I was fine with that. At the end of the day, if I'm going to put my name on something, it's the most important thing to me is that it's reputable, right? No matter who has whatever investment, whoever's cut checks along the way. And so for me, that's what I took out of it, was just an understanding of, hey, I could take this a little slow. I'm not 26 like him. I'm 40, right? I've got a little bit more experience under my belt in life. And I'm okay. I don't need to be the next Mark Zuckerberg or the next big thing. What I need to do is just be happy with the person I am, waking up every day, and the people that are around me that I love in my community. That's what's important.
Can you share your journey from the startup to Anthem now, like that timeline, and what made you feel like, hey, Anthem is what I need to build?
Yeah, I really wasn't sure what was next. When I left San Francisco, as much as when I came there, I was looking for, you know, everything tech had to offer, smart people, moving quickly, breaking things. I really missed the military, to be honest with you. Not the day-to-day job. I missed the camaraderie. I missed just kind of like, hey, you're there for the mission and what it is you do. You're there for the guy next to you. In the startup land, it just seemed like a revolving door. And again, there's so much pressure out there for, whoever they're bringing in to perform. It just seemed a little disconnected. And even though everybody was super smart, I quickly realized everybody was kind of saying the same thing. There tended to be a lot of groupthink going on, or people that didn't even believe necessarily what they were saying, but they just thought their peers thought that, so that's what they would say. And for me, I was used to being in a team room where, we can kind of bust each other's balls, we can talk a little crap, right? And at the end of the day, that came out of love and what we were doing. And the expectation was you were going to perform, I was going to perform. And if you messed up, you were going to own it, be held accountable. But at the end of the day, we'd show up and we'd go right back to work. And there was just a lot of hopping around. It was really expensive to get developers, to keep developers. So it was a little bit of a revolving door. And so I had kind of had enough. I was like, I got the experience. It was amazing. I was also doing real estate on kind of my own at the end there, just to take advantage of, what San Francisco was at the time. And I just kind of realized, like, this is not what I want to be doing for the next 20 years. And I don't mean necessarily not being in tech or anything, just not in my current role. And so I had a choice. I was either going to go take another job like everybody else, or at that time, I felt like maybe I should go back to business school. For the same reasons I didn't go to business school when my buddy was going to Stanford and was trying to get me to go. I think at that time, I said, you know what, I've got pretty good experience here. I can pair that with my military experience. I think now would be the time to kind of take a breather, kind of collect myself and figure out what's next. And so when I was looking at business schools, I really didn't want to be on either coast, any coastal cities at that point. And so Booth, University of Chicago appealed to me. It was kind of right in the middle of the country. It was a little bit more grounded. And they were very analytical about the way they made decisions. And so for me, I wasn't necessarily looking for a program that had a bunch of startup and all that stuff. I actually need something to see it through a different lens. And that's kind of, what at least how I made my decision to go to school. And so for me, it was refreshing just to kind of take a break, go get some structure around all the chaos I had just done 4 years in San Francisco in the military, and figuring out how to bridge all this stuff together. And I wasn't sure if business school was right for me, other than I always wanted to pursue my own company, right? And so I always, being an entrepreneur was always appealing to me. And I just thought, well, if I go to business school, maybe I'll get some structure. I'll network and meet some people. But at the end of the day, if I want to start my own business, maybe it's a mitigating factor for anyone that, is a capital allocator that, I've kind of got my head on my shoulders. I've got some experience, some formal and some informal, and then some education as well. And so I did that for a couple of years. I went to the University of Chicago, lived in Chicago for a couple of years. And in that time, I was just looking for what it is I was going to do next. And I looked at all types of businesses. I was going to buy other businesses. I was going to start businesses. I was actually looking with another friend at the time. We wanted to start a business together. And he was looking for a second home with his dad in Montana. And they came across a broker that was trying to sell 3 meat processors. And so he asked me if I had any interest in pursuing that. And I told him, absolutely not. I was like, I don't know anything about the meat industry. I don't really know anyone in Montana. I just spent a bunch of money going to business school. I don't think, this is really leveraging my networks or anything I know, right? I would be literally starting over again. But he did invite me to meet the 3 families. So I hopped on a plane. I came out here. I met the three families. I went to the meat processors. Um, and it was crazy. It was just like I sort of just fell in love with Montana. It was so raw. And watching these families just roll their sleeves up, they've been doing this for 40 plus years and actually making the food that a lot of us eat, and just kind of inundating myself with the process of what the supply chain looks like, what these small businesses look like, how they run their businesses. I just kind of fell in love with it. And at the time, I remember, everybody was kind of doing the same thing in Silicon Valley. It just seems like, the money's always going to the same. At the time, it was software as a service. Now it's AI. Whatever the trend was, that's where it kind of gravitated towards. And there's a lot of smoke and mirrors. A lot of times you're coming up with an idea, you're putting on a napkin, and you just have to kind of raise the money to then go fulfill, whatever the business vision is. But this was just 40 years of just doing the same thing. These people were actually making the products that we were eating. It was so interesting to me. And I sat down with all of them. I ran through all of their financials just to see how they ran their businesses. And at the time, my buddy and our idea was to do source verified beef from Montana. And with climate change and deforestation and everything that was going on, a lot of people just don't realize where their beef comes from. And most of it comes from Canada. It comes from Brazil. It comes from Mexico. Even the grass-fed stuff comes from Australia. So you're not getting it fresh. It's like frozen and then it comes to you. You're not supporting the American ranchers. And then you just don't know where in the supply chain, what's going on with any of the beef. And so the idea was really to brand Montana beef, sort of like you would do New Zealand lamb or something like that. And, with everything going on with blockchain and everything else at the time, it just seemed like there was a way to follow all the way through the supply chain to get source verified to the actual ranch where this cattle came from. And so that was the original idea. And then, like anything, you've got a plan, you do some research, and then you start digging in and you realize you don't know anything. And so I thought, outside of investing in these 3 meat processing plants, we were going to, come up, consolidate and make one really large company, brand Montana beef, come up with the grading. I thought the most value I could do is tell their story, right down to the rancher, the processing, the family. And then the best thing I could do is go search for money at the state level, because these families spend all of their time just trying to keep the lights on and just trying to pay their bills, pay their employees. They don't have time to fill out applications at the state level where there's incentives and rebates, tax abatements, all kinds of stuff. And if you could stack these incentives and do all these things for them, you could add a lot of value to what they're doing and help grow their business. And so I started talking with everyone at the state, and I thought that's what I was going to be able to add real value to what they were doing. The issue was, in the process of doing that, you start doing all the research and you start realizing they just don't have the infrastructure to keep all the cattle in Montana. And so our whole thesis was, and the premise of our business, we're going to build everything around being a Montana beef. And then you realize, well, they don't have the, slaughter facilities. They don't have the feedlots. So almost 90 to 95% of the cattle actually get shipped and finished in Nebraska or Kansas or somewhere else. And it's actually, I tell people all the time, it's cheaper to bring the animal to the grain than the grain to the animal. And so we were going to spend all this money educating the market on why Montana beef was so amazing, only to find out you can't even call it Montana beef. And so that was a little bit of a deal breaker for me. There were other issues, like the kids didn't want to take over for the parents, right? The next generation went to college and they'd worked their whole life to get out of that small town. They didn't want to be stuck there running some meat processor. Labor is super tight in Montana. So there's just a lot of issues, and these were all very old processing plants that needed to be updated, and they were all state inspected, not USDA, which means you couldn't even sell across state lines. And in the process of really digging into their business model, you really see like they need to sell everything off this animal, everything down to the bones for dog treats. And when you have a vision for what you think is a premium Montana beef that's so superior than anything else that's out there, you start to see that there's a conflict in what you envision for the company versus what reality is, which is keeping the lights on. And when you need to keep the lights on, you're not even a brand at that point. You are a manufacturing business model, and that's completely different. And there's a lot of private label that goes with that. There's a lot of other issues where you've got to send that trim and you've got to send that meat somewhere, and you'll take whatever price you can get sometimes. And so that was a very valuable lesson I learned, because ultimately when the deal fell apart, it was too hard to put together for these three families because they were competitive. Nobody wanted to work for each other. And we needed all of them to roll over their equity because we needed their expertise to build this out. And they were always overvaluing their business relative to the other business. And so it was just this endless negotiation that I spent 8 months kind of pursuing that, there was just nothing there at the end. I was stuck with one plant, and my buddy invested in that one plant. And I looked at this and I said, I didn't come here to invest in just one meat processing plant, right, at that point. But I was going to meat processing conventions. I was like meeting everyone at the state level, meeting the ranchers. So for me, I just said, well, what if I just, instead of telling their story, I tell my story, right? And we would be a veteran-owned meat snack company. Because what I learned in my research was the value add at the top of that chain, if dog treats and and the cuts for steaks and everything is how most of these guys make money, but the real money ended up being in kind of the value added products, which was like the snacks and stuff like that. And that was always going to be one component of what we were doing anyway. And so I just said, well, what if I just do that? And that way I don't need to tell the rancher story, and I don't need to tell the processor story. I could just make it my story. And if we do that over time, I can catch up. I'll never catch up to the 40 years of experience, these people have doing this. But if I just do one thing, which is just jerky or just meat sticks, and compound that over time and just get really good at that one thing, I can catch up, right? I mean, it may take me a long time, but overall I can catch up. And so that's what I did. I just kind of put my head down and started Anthem Snacks, and it's been a fun journey since.
I want to ask a few questions about your journey. First is, when did you start business school? At what age?
Oh man, what age? Probably 36 or something. 30, yeah, probably 36.
Would you say that's atypical for your class at Booth?
No, I was older for sure.
And I think most people who go to business school start between like 24 to like 28. I think like that's like the the reason I highlight that is I think business school is a great, you use the words formal, informal, educational. I think it's a great way to kind of round out one's kind of knowledge. I tell veterans it's not a requirement, but it's a nice to have. And what I really like about your journey is that you weren't afraid to go to business school, even though you were a lot older than your peers. And so I'm curious if you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I'll tell you this, like the calculation that went, for me was, a lot of the guys there are a lot of the people that are going to business school, like to your point, they had worked a couple of years, they were working for a bank or depending on what school you went to, right? Because a lot of people coming out of Silicon Valley, they kind of laughed at you if you went to business school, right? Like that, most of like the developers and the people that were actually creating things. But if you go to the East Coast and the people that are in finance and doing that and working at really big companies, a lot of them went to business schools. And so for me, the calculation was, well, anyone can go to business school. Obviously, depending on, what business school you go to, puts you in possibly a different, opportunity pathway. But for me, the hard part was over. I did the military, right? I had like already risked my life. I'd already seeked adventure, did all that stuff. I then did startup land. So for me, it was like, why would I give that edge to somebody else that technically went to business school, right? And so whether you end up working for a consulting company, Bain or McKinsey or something like that, like, why would I give that advantage away? Especially when, between the Yellow Ribbon program and all the stuff that's out there. So to me, it was always one, if I do what they do and we're sitting in the same room with the same resume, well, I've got all my other experience that they don't have, right? Not to mean like a bullet point resume. I just mean like I know how to handle myself in different situations that maybe they haven't. The second piece of it is, which I tell people, if you are going to go to business school coming from the military, it's a really good bridge to transition your transition, right? To learn what the civilian world looks like, how to operate in there, how to leverage what you have done in your past experience with what you're doing now. And in my case, yes, I was older, but I always looked at it as like the same as I did in San Francisco. I was just older in San Francisco too. It was just like, it kept you young. You're hanging around a lot of young people. You're understanding kind of what's trending, what's different. And it was not only was I getting the generational difference, but coming from the military to civilian world, I was getting that gap I was trying to fill in as well, right? It just seemed like a huge chasm I was trying to cross, not understanding what the landscape was and how people think, right? You're already behind, you're already older, you're already a different generation, and you come from, a world where there's a lot of acronyms and people don't understand what you're saying. And now you're moving to the civilian world and you have to understand how to communicate and navigate that. And so that kind of wrapped everything in one. And for me, because even my experience in Silicon Valley, that's not a normal experience either. That's not your typical experience either. And so I needed something that took me from the chaos in San Francisco and the chaos in the military and being at war, something to kind of just put some frameworks around, get my bearings, kind of ground me a little bit and let me see what was the best way to move forward. And I got a lot of that through, the people in my cohort that were going to business school. So
the more I hear you talk, the more I realize you are very comfortable being uncomfortable. And that's whether it's your ODA journey, whether it's your time at San Francisco, whether it's time doing startups. And I think that's a fair bit of the founder mentality, like being comfortable, uncomfortable, or learning how to be comfortable in uncomfortable situations. The other thing that I think was fascinating that you said about those three businesses is that they value it more than you valued it. And in behavioral psychology, there's the endowment effect of like when you possess something, you tend to value it more than other people do. But the most interesting thing I think I heard you talk about was your journey, and your founder journey sounds like many other founders in that like you have a plan, but then reality hits, and then you adapt to it. And so, can you share more about? So now you realize what you want to do. You want to tell your own story. You want to work on a premium area of the market. Can you talk more now about like the first days of Anthem?
yeah, so I spent, it was just me, right? So I went from what I thought was going to be my buddy, myself, and three families, right? So there was going to be at least like, if you said, six of them and two of us, so 8 people involved in this process, to just being me. And it went from, instead of telling their story, and I was just going to kind of tweak that and really help, I had to be kind of forward facing in front of this and kind of make it my story. And so that was an adjustment that I had to, realize and overcome. And then, so I had to start with, everything from literally designing it, the packaging, working on the R&D for the flavors, meeting with who's going to make this product, to make it the website, all the stuff you probably take for granted if you're just like a specialist in what you do and you just kind of show up and everything kind of works. So I went through that whole process, which is just, honestly, you're just like right foot in front of left. And I'm funding this thing myself, right? So I'm putting money I can't afford to lose money. I've got to make everything work. I've got to be in the black along the way, understanding I could take a little bit of loss, but at the end of the day, this thing has to work out. And initially I was buying all the meat. I was trying to do everything. And so it was really tough. I was ready to launch. Everything was ready to go. And we ended up pushing it. We ended up launching in June of 2020. I was going to launch before that at the beginning of the year. And then COVID happened, right? And so the idea of some, jerky company that nobody's ever heard of trying to get on the shelves at major retailers was like laughable. People were like, I was so naive. I didn't even know where to start, right? I would try to hire a salesperson. They were asking me for brochures, which I thought was like this antiquated old way of doing things. And I was like, well, I'm just going to make a website. And then, because now you're playing telephone, like there's a brochure and you're relying on some sales guy who doesn't really give a crap about your company, who doesn't think there's any money in this, messing up your story. And so I built a website. It all kind of started with me just, let me get my story and everything I can in one place, so at least whoever's talking can just kind of direct them towards that. And then along the way, I was supposed to get married. We were supposed to have a big wedding with my wife, and then that got canceled because of COVID. My dad unexpectedly died, right? So now I'm dealing with, I'm trying to arrange all the funeral stuff in the middle. I mean, this is April of 2020. So as you can imagine, it was a mess. And I'm trying to figure out all this stuff in the middle of, starting this business. And by the way, we're living in Billings, Montana, and my wife doesn't really want to live there, right? It's not, we only moved there because I was going to invest in one of the meat processing plants of the three was down there. And, we both agreed. She's originally from California. I'm from Texas. We need to make our way to Bozeman if we're going to stay here. The issue was, it's during COVID, so you couldn't really see properties and everything. And I wasn't sure I wanted to make an investment in buying a house in a place where I don't even know if this business really has legs. This isn't like, if it doesn't work out, you're in Chicago or New York or LA where you could just kind of jump into a job. There's not a lot to do here as far as industry outside of like outdoor companies. So it's not like you're going to go get a job at, some bank or something or finance, right? And so that's what I was dealing with. It was chaos, to be honest with you, in the middle of trying to put all that together. And it was one of the most stressful times during the business and just during my life in general. It was like, the business getting off the ground, but dealing with like my dad unexpectedly dying, dealing with like, my wife not getting the wedding she wanted and all the stuff that comes with that. But like anything, it's just like being on a ruck march, right? You just realize, or any hard thing you're doing, like just put your right foot in front of left foot, you'll get through it, understand, have conviction in what your ideas and what you believe and everything else. And I've always known or thought, I'm going to work really, really hard. If it doesn't work out, I'll learn a lot along the way. My probability of success in whatever my next endeavor will probably be, that much better, and we'll figure it out. And so that's the approach I took. I really just kind of put my head down and worked really hard. And then we got our first big break with a C-store here in Montana that has, over 100 stores. And I've got, I don't really have any sales experience doing this kind of stuff. I'm probably not the best person to sell, but oftentimes if it's your story, you're probably the best person to tell it at least. And so I started doing that. And luckily we landed that account, and that showed us kind of how to, instead of going door to door, because you have to be efficient with your time. You can't go door to door every mom and pop little shop. I'd rather convince one buyer with 100 stores than convince 100 buyers with one store, right? And so that's what I did. Got my first break doing that. And then we got our real first break when we got United Airlines. And my whole thing was, everything I learned about this industry was it is dominated by 2 or 3 big players in the jerky space. Sticks is a little bit more open, but jerky was owned by two or three really big players. And to get on the shelves, it's a lot of pay to play. You've got to have a network of brokers and salespeople and everything else. And so that was going to be really hard. And I just looked at, how do I not get bullied by these larger companies? And so it's the same thing I learned doing unconventional warfare, right? It's like, where can you, the risk versus reward, where can you get the most reward? You may be taking more risk, but ultimately, where does the upside lie? And so when other people are zigging, I'm kind of zagging. And so I identified opportunities in airlines, home improvement, outdoor sporting goods, something that I thought, fit the audience I thought we would resonate with, and where we could be, again, a little bit less bullied. And so United Airlines gave us our really first big break. We spent 18 months on there, and that taught us everything, how to scale. We went from like filling, a couple of shops here and there to like, you have to go through their food safety program, which is, no joke. And so that taught us really how to scale. And we went from, shipping a couple of boxes to shipping, hundreds of thousand units a month, for a major airline, with zero tolerance for any issues. You couldn't be late. You couldn't have any mold issues. You couldn't have anything. And so that was our first big break. And we spent 18 months on there. We were supposed to be on there for 12 months, but we did really well. And they rotate the menu all the time. But we spent 18 months on there. And then from there, we just kind of had this domino effect where, like anything, you just kind of leverage your learnings, you leverage the logos you have, you get better at what you've been doing, how to tell your story. And then from there, we've just been kind of working towards getting into more retailers and all that. And then along the way, we got into some more retailers. So now we're like in Lowe's home improvement store. We're in a bunch of places right now. Tractor Supply. We're making our way into some of the really big C stores that exist. And along the way, the UFC came and found us. And when I got the email, I thought it was kind of a joke, because I was like, why would the UFC want to talk to us? But it turns out they discovered us and they thought we'd be a really good fit for, what it is they do, kind of the warrior ethos and everything else. And I told their team at the time, I don't know how well you think we're doing, but we're not doing that well. So for me, at the time they had Modelo and Monster and Jose Cuervo, and now it's Bud Light and all these really large companies. And I just didn't see how we were going to make that work. But they were pretty adamant they wanted to work with us. And so we went through a lot of rounds of talks, and their team's amazing. And we talked to a lot of sports organizations, because once we signed that deal, everybody started talking, reaching out to us. And they've got an amazing organization that was really willing to kind of water a seed, if you will, right? And just, they saw the potential in what we could be. At the end of the day, they said, look, we think our values align with your values, and we're willing to be patient, and we think there's an opportunity here. And so we signed with them in August of 22. We did our first event in Nashville, Tennessee, and we've been with them ever since.
How about AFES? Because I go to AFES stores, I see Anthem. And how did that come about? Did they come after you? Did you go to them? And how's that partnership?
Yeah, you'd be surprised. I worked really hard to get in there. They wouldn't even take a call from me. That's just the truth, right? I had to go, like anything, you got to be resourceful, and you got to know how much to push without being, too pushy. I went and reached out to their CMO. I wasn't even looking at their buyers. I mean, oftentimes I've got a VP of sales now, so he does most of the traditional ways you're supposed to reach out to people, which is the correct way, through the buyers, the category buyers, and all that. I'm looking at any way to get in where I think the story resonates. If you're a buyer, like, why do you care? It's nice that you're better known, or it's nice that you've got maybe a little bit better tasting product or a little bit better packaging, but there's not a lot of incentive for me to take risks moving something off the pegs to put you on the pegs. And even if I do want to move something off the pegs, there's a line, there's a line out the door for people that are constantly hitting me up. So I never made headway with the buyers. And so I just started realizing, well, you know what? I'm going to go above the buyers. So I started usually with it could be the CEO, it could be the CMO, anyone where I thought we should align with our values. And so I pushed that through the CMO all the way down to the buyer. And I just told them, I was just honest. I said, if I can't get into AFES, well, then who the hell can? If this is some gated community that all you're going to do is carry Jack Links and Alberto, good luck to the next guy, right? Like your whole thing is you're supposed to be, you're supposed to have an opportunity for veteran-owned companies. If I can't get into AFES, who can get into AFES? And as you can imagine, the CMO could probably see where that was going, right? And I told him, I said, look, I'm not asking for any special treatment, but if this is some gated community where it's only pay to play, stop promoting yourself as like this, organization that's helping veterans, that's doing all this great stuff, right? And so that was how we got in. We're in NextCom right now, so the Navy Exchange, and it's kind of, yeah. And so now that I've got a real salesperson, we work with a real broker network, it's much easier to get into these places. Not to say it's easy, but there's more of the conventional way to get in, right? Which is relationships that are already built, a brand that's already established a little bit, and they can pitch it. But as you can imagine, when you're first starting out, they get calls all the time from a lot of different brands. And the question is, why are they taking your call? Why would they take the risk to, put your product on the shelf if there's not enough reviews, or they don't think you have enough of a, social media following, or whatever the case may be? There's not data out there to show that you're already selling in a lot of organizations. And so you just have to be, persistent in what you do, right? So.
we've talked over the past few years, and every time we talk, I come away with thinking you're immensely resourceful, just with how you built the business, how you fund the business, how you talked about AFEs and UFC. Can you share more about your approach to business? Because I think that could be really helpful to those who are thinking about doing a startup.
Yeah, I approach business the same way I approach life in general. Like I've always, I don't mean to say it that way. I've always got kind of a chip on my shoulder, right? Like I think that's how you get, for me, that's how I get the most out of what I'm looking to do. Um, and so what that includes is I don't, I walk around honestly believing I'm not that talented at what I do where I could take, half the time off and give half effort. Like I have to do 100%. So I'm 100% in and committed to what I'm going to do. Um, I usually, just like when we did land navigation in the military, just take a breath, right? Put together a plan. That'll save you way more time than rushing out there and trying to figure it out on the go. And so I've got a plan. I try to stay disciplined to the plan, have high conviction in what it is I'm seeing out there or what I've initially believed, but always be willing to adapt, right? And so I think the common thing throughout special operations is just that ability to like focus, commit, and adapt, right? And so for me, that's really the foundation. After that, you can add frameworks, you could add all this other stuff. But in between it all, I could tell you, it still comes down to human characteristics. Like it really is about relationships, right? It really is about staying true to your word, doing all those things, at least for what I do, right? I know there's a lot of people that overpromise and everything else, but for me, it's really important to do that. And most of it comes down to just putting in the work, dealing with adversity, right? And then kind of getting right back up, as cliche as it is, and just keep going, right? I know that sounds so cliche to a lot of people that feel like they don't get the breaks and they don't get this or that, but that really is what it comes down to for me. Because if you just keep putting in the work and showing up day after day, I believe you're going to get your opportunity. You're going to get a break. You're going to get your opportunity. And the question is, are you prepared to take that and take everything you've put into it, learned everything, and seize that opportunity and max it out at that point, right? And so I'm always expecting something to happen, but not out of thin air, right? I mean, I put a lot of coals in the fires. I'm working really hard across the board. That's always the bet I'm doing. And then at the other end of this is I always look at like, what is your advantage? So to me, again, that chip is kind of my advantage, but also just being different. If you're going to read every book that's out there, if you're going to do everything that's a case study, everybody's studying that stuff. Everybody's working off the same template of what helps somebody else succeed. And there's different variables along the way. And you have to realize you're going to have to take risk to get outsized return. You're just going to. And it's got to be calculated, right? And so you can determine your expected value. You can do all that other stuff. But at the end of the day, there's intuition. And then there's, a calculated risk you're going to take. And so if I'm going to fail, I'd rather be bold in failing than, being a little bit too complacent or gun shy and doing what everybody else is doing and then hoping I stand out. That's just not, to me, that's just not realistic. At least be an entrepreneur.
I totally agree with everything you just said, and I think it's like gospel for any entrepreneur or aspiring entrepreneur. I'm curious, what does the future hold for you in Anthem? And obviously it's unpredictable, but I guess if you could wish a future, what would that be?
Yeah, in my world, I envision us being a national meat snack company, right? So I really figure plan on us competing with the Jack Links of the world, with the Chomps of the world, and everything else. And then I want to be able to show that we could be. I mean, we're named Anthem Snacks, not Anthem Jerky, not Anthem Meat Snacks, right? I believe we can cross over into other snack categories and be a national snack company. And for me, that's important because along the way, I mean, we haven't really talked about it, but along the way, a big reason, when I started this, and it was going to be any business I was going to start, leaving San Francisco, I was looking for purpose. And business is great, but I learned along the way I could take on the next challenge, mildly succeed or succeed, however someone would define it, and still not feel fulfilled at the end of the day. And I miss a lot of different aspects of being in our community. And so no matter what business I was going to start, the mission piece was going to be a big part of that and the giving back piece. And so along the way for me, it's really how, maximizing what I think the potential is here to show that a veteran-owned and a veteran-led company can compete at a national level. And then along the way, showing it's not only, for who we do business with, it's good for business to give back. And I mean, really to give back to the veteran community. I think it's to really show them on the P&L that it is good to show your consumer that not only do you support veteran-owned businesses, which are really small-owned businesses, but you support veteran-owned businesses that have the receipts to show they give back to the veteran community. And if you can give back alongside the small veteran-owned business, that should resonate with your customer and build some brand loyalty. And I think that's important.
That's awesome. So inspiring. And the beautiful thing is, not only is the story compelling, but the product is compelling, right? And so oftentimes someone can tell a great story, but the product's not there. I can say for myself and for my kids who are big fans, you all have great products. And so you all started with beef jerky, and now you have beef sticks. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, beef sticks was always something I was looking at. I just wasn't sure. I thought initially for us to be in Montana, I thought jerky was the appropriate thing to start off with, because at the time what was kind of trending was biltong, which is kind of South African. And I wanted to do traditional jerky being in Montana. That was important to me. And I wanted to show all the way down to supporting the American rancher. But as you start to look at the data, sticks was trending in a much different way. And you take companies like Chomps, who did a great job of carving out a female audience, right? So they started working their way into natural and grocery. I just think it's a little bit different. It's a cheaper price point. You can have a little bit more fun with the flavors. It's more convenient because females don't like to necessarily put their hand in the jerky bag. You can just kind of roll down the stick. And so for me, sticks was important. And so most of the sticks you see out there are either a pork beef blend, which are in convenience stores, or they're grass fed. So if you look at Chomps and some of these other brands, they're grass fed beef. But most people don't realize that only 3% of grass fed comes from the United States. So that means it's frozen coming from Australia on some shipping container, and then you have to thaw it out. And to me, that's kind of gross. And so it just seemed crazy that we're in America and we're not supporting the American rancher. So we make ours with 100% American beef, which is really important to me. And it's crazy. We actually pay more for American beef than if we were to bring it from Australia. But I just believe that much in supply chain and supporting American ranchers. I think it fits with, the military background story and everything else that happens, and being from Montana. So sticks are a huge opportunity for us. We launched that in April of this year, and it's been pretty amazing. I took all the things I kind of got wrong with jerky. I took that into sticks. And, the short version of it is, when I looked at the research on jerky, you start seeing what the top flavors are. And so you figure you have to make those flavors. But the truth is, everybody's making those flavors. And so what are you going to offer a buyer for the 10th original or the 10th teriyaki on the peg that they already have? And so I learned later on, when we came out with smoked honey and bourbon, our two unique flavors did the best, right? And our bourbon is made actually from Willie's Distillery, which is a former Green Beret smoke jumper here in Ennis, Montana. And we use real bourbon, and that story just resonates, right? And so what I did with the sticks is I wanted to be more colorful, more forward-leaning on the flavor profile, and really appeal to not just a female audience, but a male audience as well. Where could we do what some of these other brands can't do, which is sell in grocery and then still cross over to convenience store? A lot of the times, if you take the Jack Links out there, they do really well in convenience stores, but they don't do well in the natural channel, just because it's not a healthy product. And if you take the Chomps, they do well in natural and grocery, but they don't do well in convenience. And so I want to be able to show that we could, that thread through both would be, we could operate and play in both spaces. And so sticks is a huge opportunity for us.
And it shows that Anthem Snacks is more than just one product. It can be a suite of products.
Yeah. And to be honest, we almost launched Trail Mix at one point during the pandemic. We were going to launch that first. I wanted something that was going to complement complement our jerky for people that didn't eat meat. And it turns out, especially during the pandemic with logistics, it was almost impossible to source all the nuts, because the nuts are from all over the world. And so to get a steady supply at the time, it was already hard enough. I'll tell a quick story. When we were working with United Airlines, we have a contract that says, this is our price, and we'll deliver all the time. And at the end of, I think it was like the end of 21 or whatever the craziness was, I was buying beef spot pricing on the open market. I was like pretty much a commodity trader at that point, which is the worst thing I could be. And so, I've got locked in contract with United Airlines to deliver a lot of product, and I'm spot buying rounds on the open market. And, I don't know how you model that out. And so after going through that, I was like, if I can't even do that with beef from America, where I just buy the one thing, it's just rounds of American beef, good luck sourcing all the nuts from all over the world. You know what I mean? Like I ran away from that at the time. So maybe I'll revisit it now that, things have calmed down. But at the time, that just seemed like the worst idea coming out of what I just did with United Airlines and trying to buy beef.
And so if I'm a customer, I can buy you at AFES, I can buy you at Lowe's, I can buy you online. Where else can I find Anthem Snacks?
Yeah, you could buy us at Wegmans, Grocer. You could buy us at Thrive Market now. We're working hard to get into a lot of different places. So, and then you could always go on anthemsnacks.com, or you can go at Anthem Snacks on IG and Facebook as well.
Amazon, yes or no?
Not yet. We're working on Amazon.
Cool. I have some rapid fire questions. Favorite movies?
Oh man, favorite movies. The Big Short's my favorite movie.
Nice. Interesting. A finance movie, and another kind of meta kind of character trait I'm getting out of you is you're very analytical. And so that feels like it kind of aligns with that. Favorite music, songs, or bands?
The band is my favorite. So Atlantic City and stuff like that. Yeah.
Interesting. Favorite snack that's not Anthem? And it can be chocolate, it can be licky chewy, just like any random snack. Chips, yeah.
Yeah, I got a soft spot for chips. I like the crunch, and I love chips.
Okay, cool. Favorite books?
Favorite books, The Undoing Project, which is also coincidentally a Michael Lewis. Yeah, I love that book. I'm reading The Alchemy of Air right now, and Anthem's a great book. I love the book Anthem.
Interesting. Anthem by Ayn Rand. Is that actually why the company is named Anthem?
It's part of it. At the time, you have to find something to trademark. So, you just have to see what's available. At the time, the national anthem stuff was going on. Everybody was kneeling for in the NFL, which I didn't love. Which no matter how you felt about it, I just didn't love the idea that people were looking at our anthem in like a negative light. And so I always thought like, what would be kind of a mantra for the company, or, what we say is like the people that do that, that actually serve this country end up being the heroes and the lyrics to our anthem. And then the last part was, Ayn Rand, right? So I love that book, especially, dystopian at the time of like, rediscovering individualism at the time. I thought was just, it made sense then. And to me, it makes more sense today.
Favorite leaders, historical or present?
Oh man. Favorite leaders, historical or present? I just think I read a lot of nonfiction books, right? And I think it's to read any of these guys that had to make tough decisions when it wasn't the popular thing to do, I thought was extremely impressive. So I've read everything from Henry Kissinger to Rockefeller to all these guys, and they all have their flaws, right? And some of them are really good on the business stuff that they do. Others are really good on the leadership stuff that they do. So I'm kind of agnostic to that. I don't have like a favorite leader necessarily. I just always love the backstory of what that journey looked like, how they made decisions, and when they got power, what they did with power. Sometimes it wasn't very good, right? But that's okay. It's just understanding how they make their decisions.
That line about power is interesting. My two favorite power quotes are the one that everyone knows, which is with great power. Oh, there's actually three. There's the Spider-Man with great power comes great responsibility. The second one with absolute power corrupts absolutely. But
Correct, absolutely. Yeah.
but my favorite power quote is power reveals. When you're trying to, it's a Robert Caro quote. When you're trying to accumulate power, you kind of camouflage like your goals and your schemes and who you are. But once you have power, it's very revealing how you act, and your true character comes out. Nate, this was amazing. We're rooting for you and Anthem Snacks. It's a great product, great products. Please, folks, go try out Anthem Snacks. I think you'll find it as delightful as my family has found it. Nate, thank you for sharing your journey, and we wish you the very best.
Thanks again for having me on, Tim.